Hey, I'm Jimmy, and this is Philosophy for Everyday Life. This is my third video on Stoicism. In the first one, I talked about Stoicism's most powerful insight, and then I talked about 3 reasons why Stoicism doesn't go far enough. In that video, I actually only talked about the first 2 reasons, which are that Stoicism doesn't have an adequate account of the role of emotion in human life, and that Stoicism can't really account for the human propensity to evil. It thinks of all evil as coming from our inclinations or a tendency to follow our inclinations passively rather than actively choosing what we're going to do in our lives. But it can't really account for what someone like Kant would call malice. And I used the character of the Joker to explain what that idea means. In this video, I want to talk about the third reason that Stoicism doesn't go far enough, which is that it results in moral absurdity. So to explain moral absurdity, I'm going to start with the philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe's famous essay, Modern Moral Philosophy. Anscombe talks about Stoicism at several points in this essay, and she thinks that it has what she calls a strained idea of human flourishing. And let me try to explain what that means. She asks us to consider a situation where we find ourselves obligated to do something, even though the results will be very bad for us. For example, say I'm in a situation where I know the only way I can save my life is by telling a lie about a crime I committed and blaming another person. Let's say I know that if I tell the lie, everyone will believe me, and they will punish someone else instead of me. Because the Stoic believes that virtue requires us to tell the truth, the Stoic is going to say that we must tell the truth even if it gets us killed. That's what it would mean to be perfect or to be flourishing on a Stoic account. This is part of what it means to be rational, to conform to nature, and even to be happy for the Stoic. But Anscombe thinks there is something unsatisfying about the Stoic answer in cases like this. She says it is strained because Stoicism basically tells us that when virtue requires suffering, we should just accept it as one of the inevitable misfortunes that befall human beings. But this particular misfortune is unique because we actually cause it by means of our virtuous behavior. This lands us in a dilemma, because part of what Stoicism claims is that we perfect ourselves as human beings by following reason. But in this case, following reason results in our death, which makes continued human perfection impossible. So it seems we have encountered a case where Stoicism's principles have undermined its objectives. Stoicism tells us to follow reason so we can perfect ourselves, and ultimately so that we can be happy. But it doesn't have anything to say when following reason ends the quest for perfection altogether. Now, the Stoic could respond by saying that even though being virtuous might sometimes get us killed, this is still a type of human perfection. We might view these unusual situations as tragedies, but they might also represent inspiring examples of human virtue in the face of tragic consequences. Anscombe thinks that this is unsatisfying from the perspective of normal human aspirations. Cases like this land us in what we might call moral absurdity. They make it seem that the universe is not responsive to our efforts to conform our lives to nature or to rational principles. They make it seem that all our efforts to be virtuous have no meaningful result in the world, at least in some cases. A powerful illustration of the kind of moral absurdity Anscombe has in mind is Akira Kurosawa's 1954 film Seven Samurai. In the film, a village of farmers hires 7 samurai to defend it from bandits who have promised to return at the end of the harvest to steal all of their crops. Throughout the film, most of the farmers display a profound lack of virtue. They are cowardly, selfish, petty, and small-minded. The samurai, on the other hand, are generally courageous, self-sacrificing, generous, and noble. At the end of the film, and let this be a spoiler alert, the farmers and the samurai defeat the bandits. But 4 of the samurai are killed in the process. As the farmers are celebrating their victory, the 3 surviving samurai stand to the side and watch, we might say, stoically. The leader of the samurai observes, "So, again we are defeated. The farmers have won, not us." We might admire the samurai and have a certain amount of contempt for the cowardly farmers. But there is also something morally absurd about this outcome. It doesn't make sense that the virtuous samurai would die defending the cowardly farmers, or that the samurai who survived would not really be able to participate meaningfully in the celebration of victory. Possibilities like this are what Anscombe thinks is strained about Stoicism. And it's why some of us have a hard time with films that don't treat us to a happy ending. So the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who I talked about in my 2 previous videos about Stoicism, was very sensitive to this problem of moral absurdity. He believed that, in his words, the Stoics had chosen their supreme practical principle quite correctly, namely virtue, as the condition of the highest good. And for Kant, the highest good is not just virtue or not just happiness, but the combination of virtue and happiness in the proper proportion. So the highest good is achieved when a person has achieved perfect virtue, but also when they have acquired a corresponding degree of happiness. So he says the Stoics had chosen their supreme practical principle quite correctly, namely virtue, as the condition of the highest good. But inasmuch as they represented the degree of virtue required by its pure law as fully attainable in this life, they not only strained the moral capacity of the human being, and I'd like to note that both Kant and Anscombe use this word strained when they talk about Stoicism. They not only strained the moral capacity of the human being under the name of a sage, far beyond all the limits of his nature, and assumed something that contradicts all cognition of the human being. But also, and above all, they would not let the second component of the highest good, namely happiness, hold as a special object of the human faculty of desire, but made their sage like a divinity in his consciousness of the excellence of his person, quite independent of nature. Thus they really left out the second element of the highest good, namely one's own happiness, placing it solely in acting and in contentment with one's personal worth, and so including it in consciousness of one's moral cast of mind, though in this they could have been sufficiently refuted by the voice of their own nature. Kant is making 2 distinct points here. The first is that the Stoics expected too much of limited and weak human beings. They expected us to be able to achieve a degree of moral perfection that is unattainable, if not for everyone, at least for the majority of persons. Kant says that in this respect, the Stoics asked human beings to do something that goes beyond the limits of their nature. The second point is that being virtuous is not the only important aspect of human nature. It is equally important to human nature that we pursue and achieve happiness. Kant calls this the second component of the highest good. So, it not only requires something like superhuman virtue to achieve the Stoic ideal, that ideal also leaves out an important aspect of human nature, which is that for us it is important not only to be conscious of our own perfection or virtue, but also in some way to have a degree of happiness that corresponds to our virtue. And we should also note that Kant is doing what we could call an internal critique of Stoicism, because the Stoics say that virtue is living in accordance with nature, and Kant is saying that the Stoic ideal actually fails to consider human nature accurately in these 2 ways. And an internal critique is when you say that some system of thought doesn't live up to its own principles, and that's what Kant is doing. So in making these points, Kant is saying that the Stoics fail at their own game. They claim to be following nature, but in setting up an extreme and nearly impossible moral standard and in neglecting happiness, they are ignoring 2 essential aspects of human nature. So Kant thinks Stoicism needs to be supplemented with the idea of moral hope. We might think of hope as a religious idea, but Kant thinks there are philosophical reasons for being hopeful. He puts it like this: it is necessary to accept, in accordance with reason, in its theoretical use, that everyone has grounds to hope for happiness in the same measure as he has made himself worthy of it in his conduct, and that the system of morality is therefore inseparably combined with the system of happiness, though only in the idea of pure reason. It would take a lot more explanation to unpack all the details of this claim, but I'm going to conclude here simply by noting that there is a very powerful philosophical argument for moral hope, whether in this life or in a future life. And Kant thinks that in order to avoid the type of moral absurdity we encounter in a film like Seven Samurai, we need a philosophical account of hope. We get something like Kant's idea of moral hope in Martin Luther King Jr.'s phrase, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Both Kant and King hold that we need a reason to think that happiness and virtue will ultimately be distributed proportionately. Stoicism has no place for this kind of hope. And that is the third reason why Stoicism is not enough for everyday philosophers. So I have a final observation I'd like to make about Stoicism, which is that I think it's especially suited to be the philosophy of the 1%. But of course, I'm going to have to save that for my next video. In the meantime, let me know what you think. Does Stoicism lead to moral absurdity, or can it find a way out of this problem? Does Kant's idea of moral hope seem promising? I'd love to know. If you'd like to continue the conversation, leave a comment below, like this video, and subscribe to my channel. Until next time, carpe diem.